Okay, now shall we start the second session? It's okay? Okay. Okay, so my name is Satoshi Mizobata. I make a role chair in the second session. Okay. And in this session, this session is a little bit longer than any other sessions, 2 hours. So please enjoy 2 hours. However, if you hope to, you yourself has to take yourself by yourself. Okay. And in this session, we do have 5 presentators. And however, main topic is covers 3 topics. One is Japan-US relations, and the second one is Russian problems, and third one is Bruno. So China-EU. Okay, China-EU problem. Okay, so and anyway, so each speaker has 15 minutes, at most 20 minutes. Okay. Please make your presentation. Okay, first presenter is Dr. Podoba Zoya, Associate Professor in World Economic Department, St. Petersburg State University. Her topic is Path-Dependency in Japan, US, Contemporary Advantages. Zoya-san, can you arrange? Zoya-san.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, please start.
Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with words of gratitude to the organizers of this conference. It's an honor and pleasure for me to be a part of this event. Our session is devoted to state capitalism. It is opposed to liberal market economy. And the USA sees the system of state capitalism as a challenge to the American-led market capitalism and is seeking to shift the direction of coordinated market economies policies through protectionist measures. The USA used to accuse Japan of not practicing a free market economy and claimed that in Japan, exclusionary business practices such as keiretsu and government interventions spread widely across economic activities, made the entry of foreign firms and imports difficult. So Japan was one of the first bright examples of the economies accused of unfair trade practices. And today I would like to make a presentation of my study devoted to Japan US trade relations. The structure of the presentation is as follows. You can see it on this slide, but I will skip it in order to save some time. So Japan-US trade relations in the second part of the 20th century is the story about trade frictions that can be divided into 2 periods. Trade conflicts between Japan and the United States can be traced back even to the pre-war period, when increasing exports of Japanese textiles to the United States led to the accusation of unfair competition. Almost all the conflicts since then have arisen from complaints about the surge of imports from Japan to the United States market. Complaints about the lack of access to the Japanese market arose only in the late 1970s, the beginning of 1980s, when bilateral negotiations on market access were opened between the 2 countries. So let's look closer to the first period. Post-war trade conflicts with the United States began with a surge in imports of Japanese cotton textiles. Protectionism grew in response to complaints from the US textile industry and labor union, rather than itself taking unilateral measures such as imposing import quotas. The USA asked Japan to set a limit on its exports. This was the beginning of a long history of voluntary export restraints. But these restraints were not really voluntary, but adopted under some duress. And most of them were informal. Japanese exporters voluntarily limited exports to the US market without any formal governmental agreement. And these arrangements applied not only to major Japanese exports such as textiles, but also steel, color televisions, machine tools, automobiles, semiconductors, reflecting changes in Japan's economic structure, but also to minor products such as pottery and cutlery, for example. So the United States set the precedent for voluntary export restraints, and the enlargement of foreign protection directed against particular Japanese industries has seemed to be an inevitable accompaniment to Japan's inclusion in multilateral agreements liberalizing tariffs. In spite of Japan's full participation in multilateral tariff reduction, it frequently has been embroiled in contentious trade disputes with the United States. By the end of 1980s, according to the estimates, around 30% of Japanese merchandise exports to the United States were subject to restrictions. By the mid-1980s, a substantial fraction of Japan's exports to the US were subject to restraints. Nevertheless, protectionist pressures in the USA seem to grow rather than dissipate. To counterbalance this pressure, American politicians and government officials attempted to shift the focus of US trade policy away from Japanese imports and toward expanded sales of US products to Japan, particularly in closed or regulated markets there. The US government has demanded and obtained, under threats of retaliation, many Japanese concessions benefiting American exporters to Japan. Trade talks became dominated by issues of market access. Bilateral talks on market access originated from US demands to open the Japanese beef and citrus markets in the late 1970s. And in the 80s, trade conflicts over market access spread to manufacturing industries and services. Between mid-80s and the early 90s, the United States introduced a new style of talks specifically aimed at opening up sectors seen as close to competition, included the market-oriented sector-specific talks, the Structural Impediments Initiative, and the US-Japan Framework for a New Economic Partnership talks. So started the era of voluntary import expansions. This word entered the lexicon of trade policy after being first noted by Jagdish Bhagwati, who coined the term to show the symmetry with voluntary export restraints. As such, VIEs are the import counterpart of voluntary export restraints. While voluntary export restraints set a quantitative ceiling on a country's exports of a given product to another country, voluntary import expansions set a quantitative floor on a country's imports of a given product from another country. And voluntary import expansion originates from the famous semiconductor agreement between the US and Japan in 1986. And thereafter, VIE has become an important market access trade policy that aims to open foreign markets that are considered closed. It is implemented on the ground of fair trade argument and has a nature of results-oriented trade policies that focus on concrete outcomes. The of semiconductors, beef, oranges, wood products, of course, auto parts, telecommunications, and other items. Through it all, Japan has only rarely lodged official protests against the trade policies or practices of the United States. From the one-sidedness of the complaints, one might think that Japan-US trade friction really is about Japan's unfair practices and closed markets, but it isn't. For example, in 1985, anti-Japan protectionist sentiment in Washington reached its high water mark. Not coincidentally, that was also the year of peak real appreciation of the dollar relative to the yen caused by the Reagan administration ongoing expansionary fiscal policy. So it was the strong dollar, not the closed Japanese market or unfair Japanese trading practices that had promoted sales of Japanese goods in the USA and inhibited the sales of US products in Japan. One of the main that gave rise to the US policy on market access was the perception that the trade deficit had been caused by Japan's unfair trade practices. The deficit with Japan was the largest of the US bilateral deficits in 1980s. Japan's share was really quite large, fluctuating between 35% to almost 60% from the mid-1980s to the early 1990s. Japan's share began to decline in the 1990s to register around 10% in the 2000s. Since then, it has stayed around 7 to 10%, but the volume of the deficit is almost the same as in the 20th century, and most of the deficit, bilateral deficit with the United States, is still attributed to the automobiles. It is noteworthy that the US trade policy of the 1980s had tremendous economic effects not only on Japan but also on other East Asian economies. Many Japanese manufacturers invested in the United States to ease the trade conflict, even though the goods could have been produced more competitively in Japan. The Plata Accords in 1985, which sought to weaken the US dollar against the yen, caused the yen to appreciate against other currencies, which in turn made foreign capital investments relatively inexpensive for Japanese companies. So the sharply higher yen prompted Japanese manufacturers to shift production abroad, also to Southeast Asia, to take advantage of cheaper labor there. As a result, the trade imbalance with the US has changed slightly. At the same time, industrial structure in both Japan and other Asian countries has undergone significant changes. The US-Japan trade frictions in the late 1990s changed in two main ways. The number of conflicts decreased and the nature of conflicts changed. I think you remember that the World Trade Organization came into being on January 1995. And in contrast to the GATT era, WTO agreement, Japan has been frequently applying the formal dispute settlement mechanism, with almost 1/3 of disputes being initiated against the United States. And Sadia Pekkanen characterized Japan's trade strategy, such strategy, as aggressive legalism. Clearly, there is an adaptation of the famous term aggressive unilateralism coined by Kawati to describe the US trade policy of the 1980s. Aggressive legalism can be defined as active use of the legal rules in the treaties and agreements overseen by the WTO to stake out positions, to advance and rebut claims, and to embroil all concerned in intricate legal game. In the second half of the 1990s, the severity of trade conflicts between Japan and the United States began gradually weaken, and this was facilitated by such factors as the gradual transformation of China into the main economic threat to the United States and the displacements of Japan from this position, and also due to the increase in the export of American industrial products in Japan and the wider use of the WTO dispute settlement body. As for current situations, Japan is currently the fourth largest goods trading partner for the USA in two ways, both exports and imports, and the fourth export market for the country. Also, Japan is fourth largest supplier of goods imports in the United States, and the third largest country with largest bilateral trade deficit for the United States after China and Mexico today. But the importance of the United States for Japan even more severe, because the United States is the first most important export market for Japan, and the second largest supply of goods imports to the country. In trade with the United States, Japan has the largest trade surplus, which leads to the country's high level of dependency on this market. The surplus in trade with the United States is almost twice that of Hong Kong, the next most important market for Japanese goods. The top 5 export and import categories of goods of two countries are shown on this slide. So you can see that the United States is still one of the most important markets for Japanese vehicles, despite long-standing trade disputes. And we should also note the growing role of imports of mineral fuels from the United States, as the USA is among the top 5 countries that supply this group of goods to the Japanese market. And moreover, at the end of 2018 and 19, this product group ranked first in the US exports to Japan. We also should say that over the past 5 years, Japanese companies have provided great support to American shale revolution, booking LNG and oil from the United States. The United States is also the leading exporter of food products to Japan, in particular the largest supplier of wheat, corn, and soybeans. And it is important that Japan has implemented trade liberalization without agriculture, as the agricultural sector maintained high protection levels for so-called sensitive products such as rice, dairy products, beef, pork, and others before Japan joined so-called mega free trade agreements. So the United States and Japan experienced a quiet period regarding trade frictions in the early 21st century. Several reasons may be pointed out for the rather favorable bilateral trade relationship. One is macroeconomic performance, because the US economy registered strong economic growth driven by the IT revolution, while by contrast, Japan experienced a long period of recession since the burst of the bubble economy in the early 1990s. So these contrasting patterns in economic growth performance resulted in reduced demands for trade protection by the United States. And besides, as part of their trade policy, both the United States and Japan were busy negotiating trade agreements, though Japan lagged behind other developed and main emerging countries in participating in FTA. And actually, Japan began establishing FTAs in the early 2000s, because FTAs became the most important trade policy for many countries, as multilateral trade negotiation under the WTO have been in a stalemate. So Japan changed its view toward FTAs as an increasingly large number of countries concluded trade agreements or regional trade agreements, resulting in discrimination against Japan. So by the mid of 2010, Japan had 15 free trade agreements and was also involved in negotiations on three mega FTAs: the TPP, RCEP, and Japan European Union Free Trade Area. But for Japan, TPP was the most important initiative because of its high quality and comprehensive coverage, and its geopolitical implication, and because, of course, the US participations. In the negotiations for Japan, the most controversial and sensitive item was trade liberalization in agricultural products. For the United States, the elimination of tariffs on automobiles was a difficult negotiation items. As you know, the TPP was signed in 2016, but President Trump withdrew the US from the agreement on his third day in the office in January 2017. And after US withdrawal, the remaining 11 TPP members went ahead to form a new agreement called CPTPP. And also, Japan managed to sign agreement with the European Union, and the entry into force of the CPTPP and the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement placed US exporters at a competitive disadvantage in the Japanese market. In particular, the most favored nation tariff rates on beef and pork were virtually applied to the United States only. For example, the tariff rate on beef was 38% for beef from the United States, but only 26% for beef from the parties of the CPTPP, such as Australia and Canada. So the United States was impatient to resolve this disadvantageous situation as soon as possible. And in 2019, the Japan-US trade agreement, along with Japan-US digital trade agreement, were signed less than 6 months after the start of negotiations. Speed in the negotiations and the legal requirements of the United States, the agreement covers only a limited number of items. That's why it is called this first stage initial tariff the second stage of negotiations is delayed or was delayed in 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic. So according to the first stage agreement, Japan and the United States have pledged to reduce or eliminate tariffs on only about $7 billion of each other's goods. For Japan, mostly for agricultural products, but Japan was able to keep the liberalization of agricultural products under the agreement at or below the level of liberalization under the TPP. For example, with regard to beef and pork, the United States was able to get equal treatment to its competitors in the Japanese market. In addition, the United States was able to maintain tariffs on autos and auto parts and only make commitments on further negotiations with respect to the elimination of customs duties. So the tariff elimination rates of the agreements are approximately 48% for Japan and around 90% for the United States. But the figure for the United States includes the amounts for autos and auto parts. But if these amounts are excluded, the US tariff elimination rate would likely to fall below 60%, which contradicts to the WTO requirements for regional trade agreements between developed countries, because WTO agreement sets the target of tariff elimination rate on 90%. So it is hard to say that the agreement satisfies this target at this point. If the US will not eliminate tariffs on auto and auto parts in the future negotiations, the agreement will not be consistent with the rules of WTO. And in 2020, just less than a month ago, 15 members of the ASEAN and some regional partners, including Japan, signed the RCEP. Is the agreement, this agreement and CPTPP are configured now forcefully stimulate East Asia integration around China and Japan in the Asia-Pacific region. So all the US and Japan relations are robust and strong. Trade is a divisive issue among the two allies. US-Japan trade frictions were in acute phase in 1960s till mid-1990s, when the countries used so-called gray area measures such as voluntary export restraints and later voluntary import expansions because of Japan's dependent position seeking an easy compromise. But since the establishment of the WTO, Japan has been seeking a rule-oriented approach based on the WTO rules coupled with the recent economic partnership agreements, gaining more bargaining power. Tokyo has long aimed for greater decisiveness, which would allow it to move away from a fragmented policy-making system favoring the status quo in order to enable meaningful internal reforms and acquire a larger voice in trade negotiation. But Japan still had to make more concessions than its counterpart in Japan in recent Japan-US trade agreement. US distortionary and beggar their neighbor trade protectionist policies failed to result in the elimination of trade deficit with Japan, and most of it is still attributed to automobile like it was in 1980s. But a more proactive economic diplomacy helps Japan to avoid future age where China alone sets the terms of the economic integration while creating opportunities to re-anchor the United States to the regional architecture. Japan and the USA have an abiding interest in working as partners to improve international economic governance through the dissemination of digital economy standards, the supply of high quality infrastructure finance in the developing world, and the codification of rules that alleviate the distortions of state capitalism in the trading system. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. So sorry, time is so restricted. So in the finally, once again, we return to the Q&A times. Okay, just next presenter is okay. Okay, next presenter is Victor Gorshkov. Okay, with professor in Kaichi International University. His topic is state-driven banking sector in Russia. Victor, can you arrange?
Yeah, just a sec.
15 minutes, at most 20 minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes is fine. Okay, can you see the screen share?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So good evening or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So my name is Victor from Kaichi International University. And the topic that I'd like to deliver today within the 15 minutes is devoted to the idea of state permission, particularly in the banking sector. So we're going to look at Russian finance, particularly while assessing the role of the state. So within the 15 minutes, right, the story that I will tell you probably, for those of you who are familiar with the Russian economy, well, you know that the state participation there is quite high, and the banking or financial sector has been conventionally one of the areas where the government control has been rather significant. And well, after listening to my talk, I hope I will convince you that the state participation has enhanced in recent years, right? Particularly due to the so-called the clearance campaign of the Central Bank of Russia that was launched in 2013, right? The campaign was launched as well, as a policy to target bank insolvencies and bankruptcies of banks in the Russian banking sector. And well, on one hand, you can look at it as a positive sign. So Central Bank of Russia is establishing the market discipline on the market. But the negative outcome of such policies is that the nationalization and monopolization trends of Russia has actually enhanced. And there is a threat on competition, and the gap between the state-owned banks and the private banks, right, the small banks and the large banks has significantly widened. So all these trends that I'm going to present you will make it a little bit difficult how we look at the role of the state in the Russian banking sector. There are complexities in assessing what has been done. Well, but before going into those details, like a few statistical data about the macroeconomic performance of the Russian banking. You know that Russia's financial system is regarded as a bank-based financial system, right? In the global competitiveness report, Russia now stands at the 43rd position, right, in terms of competitiveness of its economy. And if you look by specific indicators, the worst performance is actually the global competitiveness of the financial system, right? In that indicator, Russia is on the 98th position, right? We have improvement in the total ranking, but the improvement in the financial sector is still lagging behind. Well, so let's have a look right at dynamics with assets, liabilities, and other institutions Well, starting with the assets, oh, sorry, jumped too far. The assets of the banking sector are presented here on the blue chart line. You can see that they have been steadily increasing in the respective period, right? Actually, the increase, the assets almost doubled, right, in rubles in the respective period. So the same is true for the corporate loans and also loans to individual households. These indicators also show some signs of positive dynamics. So dynamics is positive, but the scale, right, is rather low. So what I mean by the scale is, so if you compare, right, and calculate the shares of the banking sector or the shares of the corporate loans in GDP and make international comparisons with the other countries, then the figures are not that promising, right? The scale of the banking assets is still very low. So the next slide just gives you a glimpse of on the structure of assets and liabilities. Again, here, if you compare with the other countries, we don't have many surprises, right? The corporate loans and retail loans occupy majority of the assets, right? And the liabilities are represented by the household deposits, right? And then corporate deposits, which are almost, well, not almost, but relatively of the same size. But here, well, corporate loans, right, which are a significant part of assets, they have been increasing, but the rate, right, the increase rate has slowed down. And majority of those corporate loans are for large businesses. So small and medium enterprises in Russia only get a very small pie of those loans. Within the retail sector, right, retailing loans or loans to households, these are on a significant rise. Well, in household deposits and corporate deposits, again, well, here the figures are okay, but majority of those deposits, again, is placed in the state-owned banks, and I will show you a little bit later. So, well, one of the functions of the banking sector is to finance the economy, right? The desperately wanted Russia's modernization. So from that perspective, if you look at the structure of corporate loans by sector, here we have, well, a few surprises. Well, first of all, the share of the banking sector in total investment, right, into the fixed assets is only 11%. And this is despite the fact that Russia has a bank-based financial system, right? So the rest is, of course, managed by some other funds, the company's own funds, and also some budgetary resources. Well, out of those loans that are provided by the banking sector, 25% goes to manufacturing, right, as 16.5 to the real estate. And then the third largest group is wholesale and retail sector. So, well, retail estate is kind of a financial economics, right? It has nothing to do with the building the production and manufacturing capacities. Wholesale and retail trade, again, so here in terms of long-term economic development, the contribution of this sector is rather limited. Well, manufacturing sounds appealing with the 25%, but if you look deeper into the details, right, it includes the production of food and beverages, right? So again, the products that are mostly oriented for the consumption. And well, I think it's fair to conclude that the banking loans role in providing manufacturing investment is rather limited. And also, if you talk about the macroeconomic performance, it is good to see at the share of non-performing loans, and that share, right, was about 3.8% even in conditions of the world financial crisis, right? But after the launch of the campaign of the central bank in 2012, you can see that steadily it is increasing, right? And it's about 10%, which is even larger than in some developing and emerging economies. Well, the next slide, right after talking about the macroeconomic indicators, shows you the share of state-controlled or state-owned banks in the banking sector of Russia. So here, right, you have the first line state-controlled banks, but also you have banks under financial resolution. So these are banks that technically are now controlled by the Central Bank of Russia directly. So the share of state-controlled banks, if you combine these two shares, right, in household deposits, it's 75%. In firm deposits, that's going to be 74.3%, right? In household loans, 81.5%, right? And also a significant amount is for corporate loans. Well, more than 60–70% are right in all the major indicators. So just by this data, you can get an idea of how strong the banks are. And the table at the bottom shows you the ranking, right? The top 15 banks of Russia, 9 of them are state dominated. And the scale, this is the rank for assets of the banks. So the first bank is the government-owned Sberbank, which used to be the savings bank of Russia. So its assets are 2 times larger than the second state-owned VTB of Neshtor Bank, right? 8 times larger than the private Alpha Bank, located on the 5th position, and 22 times larger than the Austrian Raiffeisen Bank. So again, the dominance of state banks is rather outstanding. All right, a bit closer. So this share, sometimes while I get the questions, wasn't this like this for all the period of Russia's development? And here partially you're right to say that the state participation was strong, but it has increased in recent years, right? And starting from 2012, the Russian banking sector has been experiencing a phenomenon which is called banking holes, right? The definition is provided here for you on the slide, right? These are significant discrepancies in the real and booked value of assets and liabilities of banks. Well, technically, what you've submit to the central bank, right, the structure of assets and liabilities do not necessarily reflect the real situation of bank management, right? So because of this, when the international sanctions started after 2014, right, and also the Bank of Russia launched this clearance campaign, which put even stricter conditions for the banking reporting system. What happened is the amount of banks has been steadily declining. So in 2012 and 2012, well, almost 1/3 of banks were lost, right? License was revoked or the bank was liquidated. And the orange line here shows you the dynamics of license revocations, right? Majority of the licenses, 113 and 105 licenses, were revoked in between 2015 2016, right? This picture, when I show it, of course, okay, what happens with the macroeconomic stability? Why the banking sector is not in crisis? Because you're losing so many banks. Somehow the negative impact of this could be mitigated, right? At first, the government was using the mechanism of deposit insurance agency, right? This organization is present in many countries. In Russia, it was established in 2004. So banks are participating as members. And if a bank is experiencing some sort of problems, then this organization, the GIA, basically helps to recover what to do the recovery procedures. However, right, because of this significant number, right, of license revocations and even for the major banks, right, which were in the systematically important list, right, this organization completely depleted its resources, right, and it could not help the banking sector anymore. So the second stage, the Bank of Russia established Banking Sector Consolidation Fund, right, which is 100% managed by the central bank board. and they started the financial rehabilitation and liquidation procedures, well, mostly rehabilitation procedures directly by the central bank. So how this is work, you have this little scheme. Maybe I'm not going into the details. Well, basically you have the decision of board of the directors, you organize the financing, you have a problematic bank, and the central bank buyouts its shares, property, loans, deposits. So technically it becomes the owner, right? And then you start the financial rehabilitation process. Well, after those procedures are finished, ideally it was planned that the newly recovered, right, bank after treatment would be available for sale to new shareholders. However, as of today, such sales were not organized at all. So all the banks that went through this new procedure are technically still controlled and managed by the Central Bank of Russia. This is significantly contributing to the growing share of the government in assets, in corporate loans, and also in deposits. Technically, you have more government ownership because of this procedure. One more blow on the competition, well, happened as a scandal between the associations of Russian banks and Association of the Bank of Russia. Well, in English, these two titles looked quite similar. In Russia, we have a distinction between these two. Well, both associations were established for the promotion, right, of business, well, banking association, right? It's for lobbying activities with the government, etc. The difference between the two is that Association of Russian Banks mostly had large private banks and state-owned banks as members. And the Association of the Bank of Russia was mostly represented in the region, right? Small and medium-sized banks. So the scandal happened when, you know, the largest state giant, Sberbank, was Gazprombank, Alfa Bank, all of a sudden announced that they are leaving this association to join the Association of the Bank of Russia. Again, for reasons, well, official reason was that this association was not representing the interests of state and large banks in Russia anymore. Well, but from the media, right, you really can see that probably there was some misunderstanding and between, you know, the policies that the small and medium banks were providing in Russia, which did not really correspond with the interests of the largest state giant. Again, when the split happened, right, the new chairman of Association of the Bank of Russia was appointed from the central bank. So again, you have more state influence in supposedly, right, in the supposedly business societies, well, business representatives of the bank. And one more trend, which is significantly increasing the government's participation, its role in the banking sector, is the establishment of MIR, right, National Card Payment System, which was launched in 2014, right after some American Visa and MasterCard announced that they might have some potential blocks of electronic payments in Russia. So the government very quickly developed this new system, right? And the amount of cards that are being issued and the transactions that have been implemented with this card is quite impressive, right? Considering that it was established just roughly 5 years ago. Well, the success between this is, of course, that partially this is a mandatory introduction, right, for social transfers such as pensions, civil servants, or the public servants. People are using these cards on a mandatory basis, right, to receive salary and some other social transfers as well. And recently, right, we have talks about the establishment of the digital ruble, right, and the government is significantly improving financial infrastructure for cashless transactions. Again, the market forces here are significantly lagging behind. Well, a few more words about the diversified state ownership in Russia. It's a very complicated system. I keep saying the state, right? But state has many faces. You have state in the face of Bank of Russia and Web.rf, which is a development bank in Russia. So these are banks developed by our special laws and regulations. And then you have the federal banks, well, controlled by federal authorities or Bank of Russia, right? Different ministries, etc. And then we can also trace the state ownership at the municipal level. And there are cases when banks are controlled by state-owned enterprises or even some other state-controlled banks. So the amount of state-owned banks, if you will multiply all this, plus add all these figures, is not quite large, but their share in assets, right, and all the other macroeconomic indicators is a very significant one. Well, since the time is limited, right, I would like to maybe state again the main message of this presentation. From the economic theory, right, we know that government has different roles in the financial systems. It can be a promoter, an owner, right? At the same time, it has to be a regulator of the financial system and the overseer of crises or some financial instabilities. So if you assess the role of government, right, from this point, you know, extrapolate this theory to the case of Russia, what we can see is that, well, Bank of Russia is a weak promoter of competition, right? A rather weak stimulator of Russia's economy, right? Because the share of corporate loans to the real sector is quite limited. At the same time, it is a hypertrophied owner of the banking sector and also related industries, because recently Russian banks are actively buying some largest IT companies or assets of those companies. So at the same time, the bank is, by doing these policies, is enhancing nationalization and monopolization of the banking sector. And to some extent, it is also a weak overseer of banking crises and destabilization trends, right? Well, this maybe point is disputable, but generally, well, I see it this way. But at the same time, right, we have to admit that the effective regulatory role of the government, particularly in the face of the central bank, can be confirmed, right? The banking halls, right? The situation when you have, 100 banks or disappearing every year, and in those conditions, right, the bank is trying to enhance its macroprudential control and supervisory function and eliminate those holes. So this role of the government, we definitely can positively evaluate. So the balance, right, between competition and protectionism, the regulatory supervisory role is difficult to judge, but maybe the Russian financial market is still maturing, right? It's been almost 30 years since the transition was over, but at some stages, right, maybe the banking sector is still going through significant transformation. Well, however, right, we might need the government at those initial stages, right? But in the long run, the level of state permission in the banking sector, in the economy in general, it might pose some significant risks, right? And cause market distortions and in some sense even suppress competition. Right, well, I hope I delivered my message within the allocated 15 minutes. If you have any comments or questions, I would like to address though at the discussion session at the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Later we will make different discussions, and the topic is very, very clear. So the governmentalization, nationalization, monopolization existed in the banking sector, and which has the risk to cause the distorts in market mechanism itself. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, next speaker is Vitalii Fedosov from Associate Professor of the Department of Finance, St. Petersburg State University of Economics. Okay, Vitalii, is okay?
Yes, colleagues, I'm almost ready. May I start?
Okay, please.
First, thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in the conference. There are many interesting topics, and now we'll talk about budget centralization, decentralization in Russia, in the world, and all these trends. Theoretical argument in favor of the fiscal decentralization is a possible allocation and production efficiency of granting public benefits. Subordinate authorities, knowing needs of citizens, can satisfy individual requirements, allocation efficiency, it's here, allocation efficiency, with lower expenditures, it's production efficiency, it's here, more fully. Identification of communication between the fiscal decentralization and economic growth is the popular direction of modern researchers. However, so far results of researches are contradictory and depend on applied methodology and the used definitions of decentralization and its indicators. And so we can't prove relationship between fiscal decentralization and economic growth and influence fiscal decentralization on economic growth. Our calculations show that the level of decentralization of subnational budgets revenues in the Russian Federations following the result of 2018 was 33.2%. I'll show you now. It's here. And green line, and that below average value over the countries of the OECD, it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 41.3%. And it's necessary to consider that the majority of the countries of the OECD are unitary states. Part of them has very centralized budgetary system. The average indicator of decentralization of subnational budgets revenues in federal states of the OECD is 51.4%. And I can show you it's here. And you can see that from 2008 to 2018, almost 10 years, fiscal decentralization is getting lower and lower, and it concerns almost all countries of the OECD, and of course it concerns Russian Federation. In general, in the countries of the OECD, the tendency of increase in centralization of the budgetary system. And if we can see on this figure, the budget decentralization in the Russian Federation decreases almost in 10 percentage points for the period of 10 years. There is a steady opinion that in the Russian Federation, the large volume of transfers is provided from the federal budget to region budgets, as allows to reach a moderate indicator of decentralization of the budgetary system revenues. But the share of transfers to region budgets made only 9.2%, you can see here, in structure of their revenues, while on average of the OECD, this indicator equals 37.2%. If to make into account that in the unitary states more centralized budgetary system, the bigger amount of money which come to the local budgets is redistributed through the central budget, then even comparison with federal states in which the share of transfers in subnational budget revenues averages 31.5% speaks about the low level of financial support of the Russian Federation regions from the federal budgets. whereby the sphere of revenues in Russian Federation has following two features. The first one, high level of the oil and gas revenues coming to the federal budget, and the second one, considerable differentiation in development of regions in Russia. And now we can see the other figure and fiscal decentralization of subnational budgets expenditures. And almost the same situation, but of course it depends on interbudgetary transfers. Next slide, I can show you subnational debts of the OECD countries and Russian federations. Despite vital issues at certain regions and municipalities, the level of debt obligations in relation to GDP in Russian Federation was only 3.2%. You can see here, red one. Average value of a similar indicator over the countries of the OECD is 24.5%. That is explained by the high level of subnational debts in large economies of such countries as Germany, the USA, Spain, Japan, and Canada, these countries. Russia is the federal state where the local government is proclaimed at the constitutional level. Therefore, separate studying of local budget is of interest of the analysis of the financial fiscal decentralization. The share of local budgets revenues in the budgetary system of Russian Federation made 12.9%. That below as average value over the countries of the OECD in general, 14%, and average value of federal state of the OECD, 18.3%. And you can see that this picture, and you can see fiscal decentralization of local budget revenues of the OECD countries and Russian Federation. Of course, it's not a big indicator, but it shows our specific of budget system. And let's carry out the analysis of the fiscal decentralization at the level of local budgets in Russian federations for revenues. As you see on the figure, our budget decentralization is getting lower and lower. For example, you can see this green line, and 17.6% in 2009, and now 12.4% in 2017. And of course, interbudget transfers for this period is getting higher and higher, and we can see that interbudgetary transfers is rising year by year. Fiscal decentralization of local budget expenditures shows the same situation. We can see that local government expenditures in general government expenditures is getting lower, and of course local government expenditures in subnational government expenditures is also getting lower. So we can make the main conclusion of this topic. Despite the theoretically proven positive effects of the decentralization processes of the budget system, the study conducted for the OECD countries and the Russian Federation showed the opposite trends in the world economy. The indicator of budget decentralization in Russia, which is already low, decreased by 10.5 percentage points over the period 2009-2018, 10 years. From our point of view, it's unlikely to increase the decentralization of the budget system of the Russian Federation and some OECD countries. As it concerns Russian Federation, we can see that there are many factors. For example, a large share among the budget system revenues is occupied by insurance premiums received by state extra budgetary funds, for example, pension funds. Next, the high share of the oil and gas revenues received by the federal budget. Low growth rates of the Russian economy, and it of course depends on sanction and depends on coronavirus pandemic and also other reasons. Implementation of the decree of the President of Russia number 204, according to which national projects are developed and implemented that lead to an increase in budget funding. The main part of the funds will be provided from the federal budget. So there are many reasons, and the main conclusion that despite the theoretically proven positive effects of fiscal decentralization, now in Russia we can see opposite trends, and these trends we can see also in the world economy. That's all. I finished, and if you have any questions, I'll try to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. And the topic concerns the centralization of budget, and which occurred especially after the Lehman shock, and at the same time, so this trend may be equal to the trend in OECD countries. Okay, so just we move to the next presentation. Okay, and after that, so after presentations, we make discussions. And the next presenter is Kazuho Yokogawa, Associate Professor in Kanagawa University. Her topic also touches the public finance, so small government of the state-led economy. Okay, Yokogawa-san, is okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Can you see my slides? Can you see my slide?
Yes, yes.
Yes, no problem.
Almost no. 2 slides, yeah. Okay, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kazuho Yokogawa from Kanagawa University, Japan. And thank you for giving me such an opportunity to have a presentation here. I just have a small problem with my computer, and just a moment, please.
すみません、システム担当です。聞こえますか？
はいはい。
すみません、今ですね、プレゼンテーションモード全部、出てしまっているので、
はい。
上の表示設定のところで、
はい。
クリックしていただいて、はい。発表者ツールとスライドショーの切り替えをしていただいていいですか？
すみません。ちょっと失敗しました。これ大丈夫ですかね？
大丈夫です。はい。こちらで大丈夫です。よろしくお願いします。
Okay. My presentation is about the role of public finance in Russia. And I prepared this presentation as one of the part of a book about Russian state-permeated economy, which is now prepared under Professor Mizobata. And Russia is known as a state-led economy or state-permeated economy or state capitalism. But its government is curiously small in terms of the size of public finance. So the aims of these presentations are firstly to explain the paradox of small government of the small red economy based on the case of Russia. Are there Also, I will consider if there are any differences in the structure of public finance between Russia and democratic capitalist countries. Let me first look at the public finance in democratic countries. The economic roles of public finance were theorized by Richard Musgrave in 1959. And according to him, the public expenditure have three functions: allocation of public goods, income redistribution, and the stabilization of the economy. And public expenditure has grown in the 20th century along with the enlargement of economic role of government. In the late 19th century, the size of public expenditure in advanced countries was about 10% of GDP, but today it exceeds 40% of GDP. The main reason of this enlargement was the development of welfare state in the 20th century, including pensions, healthcare, education, and so on. But there was a surge of neoliberalism since the 1970s, 1980s, criticizing the inefficiency of too big government. And now in the 21st century, many democratic countries are suffering from large fiscal deficits and high public debts. The German economist Wolfgang Streeck described this situation as a tax state are transforming into the debt state. Now let's look at the public finance in the post-communist countries. The initial condition which they have is a state finance in the communist period. State finance in the communist era covered the whole economy, not only the state budget, but also state-owned enterprises and other economic organizations were financially covered by the state. So the government size of the communist economy was bigger than that of the capitalist countries. However, collapse of the Soviet Union and the transition to the market economy in the 1990s required the withdrawal of state from the economy. So public spending in Russia has shrunk dramatically in the first few years of the 1990s. Besides, more serious problem was the state disintegration or disorganization. The function of government has weakened very much and it couldn't support the economic transition. And as a result, Russia has faced to the macroeconomic destabilization. Given the miserable economic performance of Russia in the 1990s, the importance of the state capacity, which supports the functions of market economy and institution building, became to be realized in the late 1990s. These functions are, for example, protection of private ownership, tax collection, giving social security, and so on. And the economists like Joseph Stiglitz has criticized IMF's shock therapy prescription for Russia and explained the contrasting result of the transition in China and Russia by their difference in the state capacity. And after 2000, Russian state has been consolidated under the Putin administration. And now the state came back, and we can observe the state intervention in broad area of Russian economy. The role of state in today's Russia obviously surpasses the economic role of the government, which was expected in the 1990s. Then how can we characterize the role of public finance in present Russia? First, we'd like to see the size of Russian government. The size of government in the Soviet Union was even bigger than in the Nordic countries. However, as a result of transition to market economy, the size of government of Russia has shrunk dramatically, and this figure shows general government expenditure of OECD countries and Russia in 2018. And the general government expenditure of Russia was about 33% of GDP, the second smallest after Ireland in these countries. And the figure in the bottom shows national burden rate of OECD countries and Russia. And national burden rate means a share of tax and social insurance premium to the national income. And here again, Russia is the third smallest country after Chile and Mexico. So we can say that the size of Russian government is very small, even smaller than liberal market economy like United States. So where can we find the leading role of the Russian government, the characteristics of state capitalism of Russia? This figure shows the balance of Russian budget. The expenditure of Russian government has dramatically decreased in the 1990s, but the drop of tax revenue was bigger. So the budget was always making deficit in 1990s. And after 2000, Russian budget began to make surplus according to the tax increase from oil and gas sector. And after the financial crisis in 2009, Russian economic growth was slowed down, and the budget balance also became unstable. The huge fluctuation of Russian budget balance is related with the dependence of Russian budget on the revenues from oil and gas sector. This graph shows the revenue structure of Russian federal budget. The blue part shows tax revenue from oil and gas sector, and these taxes from oil and gas sector make up about 40% of the federal revenue. Such a huge revenue was brought by the tax reform under the Putin government, and which made oligarchies to pay more taxes. So we can see one aspect of Russian strong hand government here. This figure shows other revenues of Russian general government, but because of the time constraint, I would like to skip this slide. Let's look at the government debt and the sovereign fund next. This graph shows the government debt of G7 countries and Russia. And as you can see here, while major G7 countries, especially Japan, this light blue line shows very high government public debt increase. But Russia is here, the orange line, and Russia has sound fiscal management, and Russia is keeping the government debt very small. At the same time, Russian government has accumulated the surplus from oil and gas revenue to the sovereign fund. Here, the fund was named the Stabilization Fund at first, and but it was changed later as National Wealth Fund and the Reserve Fund. And the remarkable thing is that the Russian government has recovered the budget surplus in 2018 and 19. And it is explained by cutting expenditures, including pension and rising tax rate of value-added tax. So we can see that Russian government has a strong fiscal discipline, and contrary to the major democratic countries, increasing public debt. And Russian government gives priority to the macroeconomic stability and doesn't hesitate to carry out the unpopular economic policy. Also, it is an effect of a new fiscal rule introduced in 2017, which keep the government spending under a certain ceiling. I think this fiscal discipline of Russia was made possible because of the Russian strong hand state, and partly by the lack of fiscal democracy. Let's turn to the analysis of the public spending next. This figure shows Russian general government spending, and social policy, mostly pension, is the biggest and growing burden for the Russian government. The second biggest is spending for national economy, and it has a counter-cyclical trend. We can understand that it is because of the anti-crisis economic policy. It has increased in 2009 and 2014. And defense spending has increased under the Ukrainian conflict in 2015-16, and then came down to the usual level. But we cannot explain the characteristics of Russian government spending by looking only at Russia. So I have compared the structure of government spending of Russia with major advanced countries. I can point out that spending for social protection in Russia is rapidly increasing, but this blue part is expenditure for social protection, but it is bigger in other advanced countries, including Japan, because of the aging society. And here the United States is exceptional. And orientation to defense, this gray part, and public order, this yellow part, is characteristics of Russia, and also for, we can say that the United States also has such a similar trend. And when compared with other countries, I can point out that national economy is relatively important in Russia, while health, this brown part, is less respected, at least in 2018. Please look at the next slide. This In this figure, the horizontal axis shows expenditure to social protection as percent to GDP, and the vertical axis indicates GDP per capita. About Russia and other and OECD countries, the share of social welfare spending in Russia is here is I can say that it is equivalent to that of countries which have almost 3 times larger GDP per capita than Russia. So we can see here the heritage of the premature welfare state from the Soviet era. And Russian people are known to have paternalistic mentality and expecting the positive role of the government in protecting social welfare. So the government needs to fulfill their demand in order to keep the popularity rating. And that can be called the social contract between Russian state and civil society. But here, a question has come to my mind. How can we explain the gap between the small government, what we have seen so far, and the state capitalism in Russia? The answer is state-owned companies are acting as a shadow budget in Russia. As Western economists like Gady and Ikes named the rent managing system or rent dependent economy, Russian economy has a huge redistribution schemes of the rent. The rent which is gained from the oil and gas sector, the redistribution are the distribution to the inefficient dependent sectors of the economy through both formal and informal channels. And in this scheme, formal taxes from the oil and gas sector are just a part of rent which these sectors receive, and the redistribution from informal tax is much bigger. And the important actors in this scheme are the state-owned enterprises. Expenditure of companies, which are under the state control, account for about 30% of GDP, according to the calculation of IMF and Russian researchers. And this figure is from a research of Russian institution. And the gray part shows state-owned enterprises, percentage of state expenditure of state-owned enterprises to GDP. And the companies under the state control includes joint stock companies, which are partly owned by private companies and state corporations. And they spend money to cooperate with a national project. Instead, they are exempted from some formal payments to the government. So their spending can be regarded as a part of the public finance of Russia. Based on this, I can say that Russia's real government is not small if the state-owned enterprise sector is included. However, the shadow budget is out of control and monitoring by Russian citizens because they are never discussed at the parliament. So if the informal budget through state-owned companies become bigger, it means the fiscal democracy in Russia will be more eroded. Here, I conclude my presentation. Firstly, Russia's government is small in terms of the size of general government revenue and expenditure. However, state-owned enterprise sector works as a state budget, shadow budget, which explains the gap between the small formal budget and the expected power of Russian government. Secondly, characteristics of Russian public finance can be expressed as a premature welfare state as well as welfare state. Thirdly, state initiative in Russia's fiscal management can be seen in the tight fiscal discipline, contrasted to the huge public debt in the advanced economic countries. And Russia's public finance is macroeconomically sound, but we can think it is a result of the authoritarian regime and partly the lack of fiscal democracy. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yokogawa. So that's a very interesting presentation. And needless to say that should be state enterprise play a role of covers the public finance. So in order to cover the fixed items of the expenditure, such as social protection and others. Okay, thank you very much. And the final presentation to Professor Bruno Darago from Italy. He's a professor of Trento University. To Harvard, Bruno, do you?
You see me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. May I start?
Yeah, please start.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope that you see my slide. Now, the issue is that of the Belt and Road Initiative seen from the perspective of the European Union. And I will briefly discuss the following issues. First of all, the economic growth in China. I will explain in a moment why I think this is important. Then a couple of things about the Belt and Road Initiative. Then we go to the main issue, how the European Union sees the Belt and Road Initiative. I stress the European Union, not the individual member countries. And then we'll try to ask, to answer the question of whether there are changes going on in this relation compared to a couple of years ago. And then I conclude very briefly. Now, economic growth in China shows some signs of worry because growth rates have been slowing down, which is natural also statistically, but perhaps a little bit more than what Russian governments desired. Trade shares of China have been decreasing during the last few years. There are various kinds of imbalances, both internal and externals, bubbles that could accumulate in particular in real estate, but also in the question of debts. The innovation system proved to be unbalanced, extremely successful, but excessively based on large companies, while China lacks largely the path-breaking kind of innovation adaptation that comes from small and medium-sized enterprises, where the most relevant innovations tend to come. And so China is meeting some policy programs. It needs to go towards a new growth strategy. Export-led growth does not have a particularly relevant future in China, both for the reaction by the United States, first of all, but also because comparative advantages in China, in particular, the low cost of labor and the size of the domestic market have been decreasing. And by the way, China is perhaps exporting production to neighboring countries like Vietnam and so on. So China has also to go towards new specialization to adapt to higher wages. It needs to promote domestic consumption. And for that, it must develop a welfare pension system. Otherwise, people will save for when they will be old and will not spend the money. So basically, China may afford a middle income trap. And obviously, it is aware of this and wants to avoid it. Just to give a very brief picture, which in my view is important for looking at both China and the European Union. The black line looks at the United States, which has a much more, let's say, soft behavior in this sense. Here, the data look at the exports of goods and services as a percentage of domestic GDP. In China, starting from basically the international crisis of 2007, 2008, this share has been dramatically decreasing. Exports did not decrease, as a matter of fact, but GDP continued to grow while exports tended to stagnate. So basically, this is the outcome. In the European Union, however, the only area in the world economy in which exports continue to grow, except the years of the crisis, compared to GDP, and even more so, as you see in Germany, the green line. This may be a problem. Why? Because as we look at current account balance, we see that two main countries are absorbing the surplus of other countries. The deficient countries are obviously the United States and Great Britain, while the surplus countries are largely in the European Union. Here, I depict the two champions in this sense, Germany and even more so the Netherlands, which have both huge surpluses and persistent surpluses in their current account balance, while China went down nearly to parity, to an equilibrium. Japan, the dotted violet line, this one, also became once again a surplus country. On average, the European Union has a surplus which is between 2 and 3% of its GDP. It is around this place. So a sizable surplus considering the size of that market. So now we come to the Belt and Road Initiative. What is the domestic motivation for the Belt and Road Initiative? Many motivations were proposed, like economic imperialism, try to conquer the world, or sometimes I heard people saying build highways and railroads to be able to invade fast Europe or Central Asia, at least, and so on. I think that if I look at the history of China, I'm not really concerned about these issues, even if we have obviously to take always into consideration. But the main reason behind that is the economic situation of China. The Belt and Road Initiative is the attempt to avoid the middle income trap in different ways. Move investments to the West, so to foreign countries, mitigate the investment bubble that is creating problems, including pollution, in the eastern part of China, supporting the production, the enormous production power of the Chinese economy, Chinese enterprises, by providing opportunities in the central western part of China and to the west of the country up to Western Europe. Move the growth strategy from the export-led to a strategy led by domestic and international infrastructural investments, and in this way also help exports. That is to say, slowing down the decrease in the export-led strategy, gaining time in a sense. The Belt and Road Initiative, however, has important and positive spillovers, including the build of infrastructure, support international trades, and so on and so forth. And these spillovers are important from the perspective of the European Union. Let me go to this. Why am I stressing this? Which is the position of the European Union on the Belt and Road Initiative. If you go to the bottom part of the slide, no doubt the EU is interested in this initiative. However, it has certain concerns, and what is important, it has an approach which is different from that of China. So opportunities, but also some concerns and dangers. In particular, in the case of the European position, the EU thinks that the approach to this kind of connectivity must be sustainable, must be comprehensive, and must be rules-based, international rules-based. And here we have some problems. Interest is obvious. Opportunities for firms, new markets, infrastructure, and partnership with China, other countries which can open new markets and create new opportunities. Concerns come from the fact that China sees the Belt and Road initiatives mainly based on bilateral approaches, and this is creating troubles within the European Union because China approached some countries, and these countries, in some cases, made a deal with the European, China concerning the Belt and Road Initiative, but this is creating clashes within the European Union. Typical examples are the Belgrade-Budapest high-speed railroad that was done largely with Chinese money, and the signature of the agreement with the Belt and Road Initiative by one of the G7 countries, member of the European Union, that is to say, Italy. Not much came out of that signature, but anyway, there are still some political progress behind it. Another concern is that typically a limited amount of local labor and local firms are involved. Mostly it is Chinese enterprises which implement this objective, and this is obviously against the interest of the European Union. Procurement procedures in China are not sufficiently transparent from the perspective of the European Union. Many materials and equipment are imported from China. Standards are not always what is normal at international level, and there are further issues: environmental issues, social issues, security issues. Pollution, for instance, may be a problem in some parts, not in Europe, but in some parts of the Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, there are differences in approach. It is not easy to coordinate these projects with EU policies and standards. Better, the implementation so far did not pay much attention to the need to coordinate with EU policies and standards. There is an uneven distribution of gains among countries, as I will show in a moment. Some countries are incurring rising debts, in particular in the Balkan countries, among accession countries, countries which would like to enter the European Union. They accumulated sizable debts with China to implement the Belt and Road Initiative investments. The EU has a strategy to Asia, which looks primarily to Japan, but it does not exclude China, for instance, and there should be a better coordination between this strategy and the Belt and Road Initiative. Talks were organized between the EU and China, but not much came out still from that. And obviously, there is an uncoordinated approach by EU member countries, as I stressed in a moment, and this is a problem. There should be, for instance, a better coordination with the EU infrastructural strategy. EU is competent for big infrastructures connecting different member countries within the European Union, but there is no coordination between this strategy and the Belt and Road Initiative. This is obviously creating problems and troubles. And I reach then the last issue. Are we witnessing changes in the EU-China relations concerning the Belt and Road Initiative? Now, Belt and Road Initiative goes largely through foreign direct investments of China in the countries that are part of this initiative. Now, if you look, these are the stocks of foreign direct investments in the EU, including the UK, for the time being, in billions of euros. This is the foreign direct investment stocks from North America, the United States largely, and Canada, more than 2,000 billion euros. The bottom, the red line, represents China and Hong Kong, which is a major investor, which is nearly negligible compared not only to the United States, but compared also to such countries, the green line, as Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and Singapore. This is offshore investments coming from fiscal paradises and so on. And the blue one is EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, including primarily Switzerland. So foreign China, direct investment from China is not apparently, quantitatively speaking, a big issue. However, and this is one interesting chart, going to 2019, are Chinese foreign direct investment in the EU this per year, annual value of completed foreign direct investments. As you see, starting from 2016, there was a dramatic decrease, which is continuing this year. Most of these continue to be mergers and acquisitions, the dark bar, and only marginally greenfield investments. Why does this happen? Different reasons. And behind the quantity, there is an interesting structural change in foreign direct investment. First of all, foreign direct investments of China to the rest of the world have been decreasing substantially since 2016. Sectoral distribution shifted. Consumer products are the most important component now. Also, the geographic distribution shifted. Northern Europe is, for the first time, the main recipient in this move. Here we see Northern Europe is the dark blue part of foreign direct investment, more than 50% in 2019, basically to Scandinavian countries. While the so-called big three, France, Germany, and UK, which had nearly half the destination, or in 2017 were more than 2/3, nearly 3/4 of foreign direct investment. Now they attract 1/3, no more, and the bulk of them are attracted by UK, which means that this group of countries now will become nearly relevant. The red is Germany, and this on top, less than 1%, is France. So a dramatic change compared to the previous years. Sorry. Oh. Okay. Just to close, this is a depiction of the attraction of foreign direct investment in different European countries. As you see, the bulk, more than 50 billion, is UK, which is now effectively out. The next one, Germany, has less than half. So basically, Germany, France, and Italy together attract more or less what UK alone could attract. Other countries, look at Eastern Germany, basically are nearly irrelevant, except Hungary, largely due to the high-speed railroad connecting Budapest with Belgrade. So, conclusions. There are strong motivations behind the China's move, strong economic motivations. This initiative gave some help to China to move in the direction of avoiding changing growth strategy and avoiding the middle income trap, but apparently not sufficiently, not only because the implementation was slowed down by different factors, including the pandemic, obviously, but more recently, the European Union restricted substantially the rules over incoming foreign direct investments, and this has been slowing down the flow, in particular, of investments, Chinese investments coming from state-owned companies. There is much greater control in order to avoid the, let's say, extraction of sensitive technologies from the European Union, technologies which can have double use, and that the European Union is willing not to allow to move to China. So, to conclude, is this initiative, the participation of the European Union to this initiative, a chance for development also of the European Union, or a threat? Now, given the importance of the rest of the world for the European Union, given the uneasy relations between the European Union and, in particular, the United States, I think that the Belt and Road Initiative offers a very important chance. There is a great interest in the European Union, but I see it rather difficult to proceed on the present basis. The two partners must sit down and find a common way of proceeding, whereby the European Union is aware that it is in the interest of the world that the Chinese economy continues to grow, but it is in the interest of China to have a relation with the European Union that takes into consideration the particular and not easy features of the European Union. The European Union is a group of countries which shares parts of sovereignty, and the European Union and China should not see only member countries, should see also the whole. And here there is still some way to go. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. The topic is very interesting. And needless to say, this BRI is very, very controversial one. And the response of EU side is very, very interesting point. Okay, thank you very much for 4 or 5 presentators. We do have 7 minutes, okay? Any questions and any comments are welcome. However, at first, to Shinshin-do, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentations, and I have written my question in the chart in the chart of Zoom, which you can all see it, I suppose. So my question is for Professor Bruno Dalago. Thank you very much for your presentation. And my question is, how do you think the situations in BRI project among EU member countries and non-EU member countries, which might be a little different situations. So if you can give me some opinions or suggestions, that would be great.
Okay, you mean I was trying to send a message because I wanted them to put a question, but okay. As I mentioned, non-member countries should be divided into European countries which are not and will not be in the European Union. Probably you are referring to Europe, right? I suppose. And not yet member countries which have association agreements with the European Union, like, I don't know, Serbia, for instance, okay, or Montenegro. Some of these countries, like Montenegro, even adopt the euro as their own currency. So they are strictly cooperating. And the approach of the European Union is different. Obviously, the European Union has nothing to say as such about countries which do not want to enter the European Union. Obviously, Russia does what Russia wants, Turkey does what Turkey wants, and so on and so forth, obviously. Then there are the countries like various countries in the Balkans which have association agreements. Those, if they want to be considered seriously for entering the European Union, must take European policies into account, must not contradict European policies. So as a matter of fact, the fact that Serbia signed together with Hungary an agreement basically against the will of European authorities to build a high-speed road is a problem. Indeed, the European Union used the anti-monopolistic regulations to not block, but to slow down that process. Interestingly, used the same approach in the case of the port of Saloniki in Greece that was rebuilt totally by the Chinese. Then in that case, the European Union withdrew because they realized that the Chinese are too efficient and they solved a big problem also for the European Union. These are two different questions. In between, there are, in particular, the EFTA countries, the European Free Trade Area countries, which have, like Iceland, for instance, or well, even Switzerland, which or Norway, which are not member countries of the European Union, but which has a special relations with the European Union. These countries even pay contributions to the European Union to be basically to have access to the single European market. If they want to have access to the single European market, they must follow policies which are not in contrast with the trade policies of the European Union. And also the Belt and Road Initiative has a relation to trade policies. So even there, there are must be some kind of coordination. What the European Union thinks must be taken into consideration. I have a big question, though. I didn't find an answer yet. In spite of all its active criticism, the Belt and Road Initiative, Great Britain has been, as you saw, the country which attracted by far most of the investments from China, in part linked to the Belt and Road Initiative. What will happen starting from the 1st of January when Great Britain should be effectively, in one way or the other, out of the European Union? We don't know yet whether part of the single market or not. It will be very interesting to see what will happen. So the nasty question which I have is that are only smaller member countries having troubles and big countries can go along freely? But this is a criticism to the European Union, not to China, obviously.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you very much for informative answers.
Okay,
thank you very much.
So, other questions is okay. And okay, I have a question to three representatives on Russian problems. So question is very simple. As far as Russia is based on the resource-based one, so I mean gas, oil and gas revenue supports the banking system and budget system itself. So then, how do you think the sustainability of the banking system or budget system in the long run? Is it possible to keep its, how should I say, mission in the long run? It's my question to three presentators. Vitalii, can you reply?
Yes, if we speak about sensibility of budget system, of course, it depends on external factors. For example, the price of oil and the price of gas. So in the last year, in 2018, the federal budget had big proficit, more than 1,500 or more than 1,500 billion Russian rubles. But in this year, our budget, federal budget, will have a big deficit, more than 4,500 billion Russian rubles. It's a very big money, and you can see that our budget system is not sustainable in these conditions, and there are many factors, for example, external factors, and which depends on our budget system. I think so.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other comment to my questions? Yokogawa-san or Victor? Okay.
Okay, who first?
Please, please go ahead. Well, yeah, this is a difficult question. In the short term, Russia has accumulation of international sovereign fund, so Russia can cover the budget deficit with accumulated money. But in the longer term, I think demand for oil will decrease in the world because of EU and Japan and many countries are planning to decrease change their energy resources so that to decrease CO2 and so in the longer term maybe oil price it's hard to imagine the high oil price will be maintained, and maybe Russia will be required to change its tax system or budget resource and to find some other financial resources, I think.
Thank you very much. Other comments? Okay.
Well, okay, if you address the question to the first speakers. So if you're asking about the sustainability of Russian economy, right, then I would agree with what Professor Yokogawa said or the Vitalii, right? In the long-term perspective, the dependency on natural resources, I think it has limits. But if you're asking me whether the banking sector is going to be sustainable, so here I would say it can be sustainable. And for the reasons, well, the ones that I can list for you is, well, if you look at the shares, right, in deposits or the corporate deposits and also the household deposits, basically you don't have an alternative rather than the state banks. And now the state banks is controlling also the national payment systems, basically, right, through MIR. If you're using all those, okay, not a large amount of funds, but some funds can be accumulated in this system. And then the role of banks in the economy, as I showed you, is rather limited. So if the Russian economy is not requiring more financing, so you can maintain having this amount of deposits in the banking system. So for a while, I guess, if you run the idea, state-owned banks are collecting the deposits, are managing the payments, right, through the national payment systems, and they also finance state-owned enterprises, right, which generate some, outcomes for the economy. Then, well, you can say it can be sustainable for a while. For how long? Well, I don't know how to make those projections, but for the time being, I think it will be run like that. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, sorry, only one question. Bruno, don't you have a question to Yokogawa-san?
Yes, but I should give a short answer to Victor. May I?
Yeah, quickly.
Okay, thank you. The data which I showed, to my best knowledge, do not include investments from Hong Kong, but only from mainland China. Those are out. Second, you are right, with Brexit, FDI could in principle be transferred or relocate to other countries, but I don't think that will happen. The Chinese probably already anticipated Brexit and perhaps even hard Brexit starting from next year, and they are there because they are interested in the Great Britain, in particular its resource basis, I suppose. So it's different from Japanese investments in Great Britain. Those may relocate and will likely relocate because they are serving the European market, continental market, in at least in great part. No, the question which I have for Professor Yokogawa concerns the concept of a premature welfare state. I think that international databases are quite often misleading because they take for granted what we cannot take for granted. Welfare state probably in Russia is not only different, structurally speaking, but also is playing a different role than, let's say, in Germany. It has a different nature, is financed in different ways, but also has a different, not only social, but also economic meaning, probably. At least I suspect. I know nothing about welfare in Russia, so I'm curious about this.
Thank you very much. Okay, so sorry, we have already embedded the next session, so just we stop the discussions. Even though I have also one question to Zoya-san, however, just we stopped all the discussions. And thank you very much for all the participants, and thank you very much for all the discussion. Thank you very much. We finish the second session. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.